Chapter 18, The Battle. Ragweed's earring saved her. So powerful, so swift was Mr. Osox's descent that he pushed a wave of air before him and caused the earring to flutter. The flutter felt like the tap of a tiny finger on Poppy's ear. She felt it and whirled. At the last possible second, she saw the owl coming and made a leap to safety. The next moment, however, she realized she had made a terrible mistake. She had leaped, not back among the corn, but farther onto the open road. Mr. Osox was now on the ground, blocking her way to the field. She spun toward the forest. In a second, the owl was up in the air and down on the other side. Once again, he had blocked her way. "Not so smart as all that, are you?" he sneered. "Well, I don't compromise with what I want," he told her. "And what I want is you never getting home alive." He made a sudden darting movement to the left. Poppy jumped to the right, but Mr. Osox was ahead of her. Just as quickly, he shifted back toward her so that Poppy was forced to halt herself clumsily. There she stood, flat-footed, panting, not sure which way to go. The owl, towering over her, laughed. "I told you what would happen if I caught up with you again, didn't I? But this time you won't have that fat porcupine to help you." So saying, he made a snap at her with his beak. Mr. Osox's mention of Aerith was the reminder Poppy needed. She reached down and yanked the quill from her sash, then held it before her like a sword. At first, Mr. Osox blinked. Then he snickered. "You don't think one of his quills is going to stop me, do you?" "That owl on the barn," Poppy panted between hard breathing, "is a fake. You've been frightened by a fake owl." Mr. Osox's beak dropped open. He hesitated. In that moment, Poppy sensed she could have gotten away, but she could not resist another taunt. "You're not an owl, you're a chicken," she cried in triumph. For an instant, the two of them, owl and mouse, confronted each other. Then a look of terrible rage passed across the owl's face. Poppy knew then she'd made another blunder. She'd lost her momentary chance of escape. Now there was nothing he'd not do to kill her. She would have to fight him. Trembling, she flourished the quill. In response, Mr. Osox spread his wings, then beat down hard with them upon the road. They threw up a cloud of dust. It was hard for Poppy to breathe, much less see. She took a step back only to hear a sound behind her. Confused, she turned. Hidden by the dust, Mr. Osox had overleaped the road. Once again, he was behind her. From there, he made a slash at her with his beak. Poppy struck out with her quill. Seeing the quill and realizing the danger to his eyes, the owl pulled back. He glared at Poppy. He snapped his beak. Poppy stared back grim-faced, gasping for breath, waving the quill before her. "If it takes the whole night, I'll wear you down," Mr. Osox hissed. "And all it takes is one mistake on your part. Then you're done. Finished." He made a forward feint. Poppy danced nimbly back. Mr. Osox struck again. This time it was not with his beak, but with his talons. Poppy, quill up, dodged the talons with a quick sidestep, but she knew her only hope was to get into the corn and hide, otherwise the owl would overpower her. Making sure of her footing, she began to back toward the forest. Just as she had hoped, Mr. Osox leaped up and landed between her and the trees. It was then that she raced for the corn. Mr. Osox was just as fast. Grasping her strategy, he barely touched earth when he took a flying hop forward to block her way. He advanced wildly now, snapping and snarling. In response, Poppy slashed wildly with her quill. Once she struck out at the owl's face, but only to hit his feathers. But though the blow glanced off harmlessly, it served to infuriate him. Mr. Osox, closing in, darted his head in and out, side to side. Poppy was bewildered. Then the owl turned briefly away from her. In a flash, she made a successful rolling dive under his wing. She was behind Mr. Osox at last, on the corn side of the road. She started to run. He turned his head in a complete half-circle, saw her, and spun his whole body about, his right wing extended full length. The wing tip struck Poppy a glancing blow to her head. Down she tumbled and landed on her back in the dust. Seizing his advantage, Mr. Osox pounced, beak open, tongue out, hissing. Poppy whipped the air with the quill. The tip of it pricked the owl's tongue. He screamed and raged and reeled back. Poppy had just time enough to regain her feet. Once more she faced him, quill at the ready. Mr. Ossox, stung, pressed forward now this way, now that, head bobbing, weaving, viciously snapping his beak. Increasingly exhausted, Poppy was forced to give ground. She crumbled to her knees. It was the moment the owl had been waiting for. With a powerful kick, he thrust his left claw, talons spread wide at Poppy's head. Poppy saw the claw coming. Using all of her strength to grip the quill, she held it up with both paws to protect herself and jabbed it into Mr. Ossox's claw as it came down. The owl gave a great squawk, fell back, and began to roll about violently. Fearful of losing the quill, her only weapon, Poppy pulled on it with all her might. But the barbs had caught. She could not get the quill loose. She was being dragged and bumped along. Mr. Ossox, screeching and flapping his wings wildly, flailed into the air. Before Poppy knew what was happening, she too was in the air. She did tell herself to let go of the quill, but by the time the thought was whole, it was too late. To drop from the height Mr. Ossox had already reached meant to fall to a certain death. There was nothing to do but hang on. Mr. Ossox, squawking, hissing, flew like one possessed. Up, down, and around he went, making loops and stalling dives, climbing and twisting anything and everything to work the quill from his claw. But the more he flexed and twisted, the more the barbs worked themselves into his claw, causing ever more excruciating pain. Poppy hung on. The fact that Mr. Ossox was dragging a claw and from that claw dangled a mouse greatly impeded his flying. His flight path became increasingly wild. In his desperate desire to rid himself of pain, Mr. Ossox ceased to look where he was heading. Violently, he plunged toward the cornfield. Once over it, he lowered his left claw, and that meant Poppy, deliberately thumping it and her along the cornstalks in the hope that the quill would be jerked out. Poppy was being battered. But each time she decided to release her hold on the quill, the owl surged forward, causing her to cling to it more convulsively than ever. Knowing she could not take much more, Poppy tried to see ahead. Mr. Ossox was skimming low over the corn tops, but when he passed beyond them, he dropped toward the ground. "Let go," Poppy told herself, "let go!" But she was feeling so groggy her own muscles would not respond. Then she saw what the owl was aiming for, the salt lick, and he was picking up speed. In his madness, he was preparing to strike his claw on that. Poppy had wits enough to sense that if she struck the hard salt, it would be the end of her. "Let go," she cried to herself again. This time she did. Down she plummeted. As she did, Mr. Ossox first rose, then dropped. Totally out of control, he slammed into the salt head on. So great was the blow that the salt shattered while the owl went tumbling head over tail in an explosion of feathers. After 3 flips, he flopped down like a sack of potatoes onto the ground. As for Poppy, she had landed on grass. For a moment she lay there, stunned, battered, and confused. She looked up into the sky but saw nothing. Then she looked across the lawn. She saw him then. Mr. Ossox lay on his back, perfectly still. His claws were drawn up over his chest, slightly curled. The quill still stuck out of the left one. Scattered about among the feathers were chunks of salt. Poppy stumbled to her feet. She took a wobbly step or two toward the cornfield. Then she stopped and looked back. Mr. Ossox had not moved. She stared at him. Slowly, not sure if she should believe what she was thinking, she crept closer to the fearsome owl. After every few steps, she paused, looked, sniffed. Still there was no movement. Close to Mr. Ossox's head now, Poppy stopped again. The owl's great eyes were wide open, staring up into the sky. His devil-like tufts of feathers were bent. His beak was open. As Poppy watched, it snapped listlessly. "Mr. Ossox?" No answer. She took a step closer. "Mr. Ossox?" His head turned slightly. For a moment his eyes seemed to focus on her. "Sometimes," he murmured. Sometimes I wonder why I bother to protect you. With that, his beak made a final clack shut. His eyes closed. Poppy knew it then. Mr. O'Sox was no longer alive.